the exam this year. I've not yet scheduled it though.
Great. All right, got people moving around a little bit on me. Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I live in Green Bay area, and I'm an education and facility master planner, and I work for MGT Consulting. So I'm thinking about taking it later in this year, so
Great.
in November, whatever that is. So.
Okay, David. Maybe he is on mute. David, if you're trying to talk, you're on mute. Otherwise, maybe if you don't have audio, you can go to the next person. Or maybe he got kicked out of the meeting. Sarah.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah McDonald. I'm a landscape architect and urban planner with Stantec, and I have not yet signed up for the exam, but I'm hoping to do so within the next year as well.
Great. Go back to David.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Capelli, founder of Capelli Cities and co-founder joint venture research Smart Cohort.
Awesome. And let's see, Peter.
Yeah, hi again, folks, or hi to a lot of you again. Peter Rafferty. I'm a consultant with Gannett Fleming, but based here in Madison. And I mentioned last time that I had used to be an AICP, but I'm taking it again in May because it had lapsed and long enough for me to get to take the test again.
Great. And who did I miss? Did I get Megan already? Okay, I think we have everybody. If I missed you, feel free to introduce yourself right now. Otherwise, I think we got everybody. All right, so we're going to get started. Sort of a similar format from last week. I have some slides to go through, but the idea is that this is information that you can take and take the PDF and look at it when you're ready to study, or if you're already starting to study, you can take that with you. I've got links in there and some different things to share with you. And yeah, we'll just go ahead and get started. I mentioned I'm the professional development officer, but I also took the exam relatively recently. So I took the exam in the spring of 2018. So a lot of it's pretty fresh for me because not a lot has changed since I took the exam. And I'm a planner for Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission. My focus is transportation planning. So that's kind of the angle I'm coming at it with, but yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. And just like last week, feel free to jump in with questions if you have questions, but we'll also have plenty of time after I kind of run through this outline for additional questions, or to really kind of take some time for questions and conversation. So last week, the meeting was all about basically the logistics of the exam and, kind of why it exists and things like that. And so I'm not going to talk about any of that this time. I'm going to just talk about preparing for the exam. And if you did miss that and you're interested, I did email it out to anyone who registered, but it will also be posted on the APA Wisconsin website as well, hopefully later this week or early next week. So today's meeting, I'm going to talk briefly about exam logistics, and then I'm going to provide an overview of the exam topics just to give folks who aren't as familiar with the exam a little bit more information. But for those of you who are taking it in May, you're probably well familiar with this. And I'm going to talk about creating a study plan, and then I'm going to go over some resources. So again, the exam logistics are that you will register to take the exam after you've applied and been approved, and you'll do that through Prometric, the third-party testing program. And the exam is offered for the most part in May and November each year. And there are 170 multiple choice questions. 20 of those are these pre-test questions, which means they don't count. They're basically testing the questions. It's scored on a scale of 25 to 75, with 55 being passing. You do find out right away if you passed or if you failed. And then you will get a more detailed analysis emailed to you as far as how your scoring breakdown went and things like that shortly after your exam. I think I got mine a few hours after. The exam window or the exam limit is 3.5 hours, but you'll be there for a total of 4 hours. They give you a half an hour for the tutorial and just kind of getting set up. And those are the locations of the Prometric testing centers in Wisconsin. So the structure of the exam, and this is really more kind of like the theoretical structure of the exam. It's really designed to test how you think as a planner. So it's going to include a wide range of different topics, and it's really just, you know, they're the best way that they can kind of come up with to test your knowledge. It's definitely not, planning isn't a topic that is super straightforward to test on because it's so complex and it's so varied. So I think that's just something to be aware of. It's not a perfect test, but it definitely covers a lot of different subjects. So a little bit of the question structure. A lot of the questions you're going to see are going to be to asking you to choose the best answer from one of the following. So it'll give you the question and it'll give you text, and then it'll give you these multiple answer options or multiple, basically you're kind of combining multiple answers or multiple possible scenarios into one answer. So that makes it challenging. I think that is probably one of the most challenging parts of the exam is the way that the questions themselves are structured, in the fact that they're looking for the best answer. So it's very possible that there can be multiple correct answers, but they're looking for which one is the best. So again, that can get pretty tricky, but it's just something to be aware of. Again, taking some practice tests is going to be huge for kind of just getting used to these questions, and you'll get a better feel for what they're kind of looking for exactly. So just an overview of the exam topics. So the exam is broken into 5 different categories, and it's balanced at these different percentages. So you can see this here on the screen. I'm not going to read everything out because I'm going to go over each of these topics in a little more detail. So fundamental planning knowledge is 25% of the exam, and this covers the big things under planning theory, the history of planning, the foundational legal principles and decisions, so those case laws that you'll need to study, the statutory basis for planning, and then some different terminology, principles of planning in some of these different pieces. So what I've done on some of these slides is I've kind of put a little star denoting the topics that from my experience, I felt were the most important to prioritize in my studying from these different topics. Obviously take it with a grain of salt because everybody has their own set of strengths and weaknesses depending on what your work experience has been and maybe just what you're interested in or your knowledge level. But I did find that spending a lot of time looking at refreshing my memory about the history of planning, those people who were kind of key at the beginning, just kind of going back to some of those. If you took a grad school program in planning or an undergrad program in planning, kind of that planning 101, planning history, planning theory stuff is a big one. And then again, for me, studying that case law was another big portion of what I spent a lot of time on when I was studying. I do remember, there are a lot of specific questions about some of those case laws and decisions and kind of what they meant for planning in the exam. 30% is plan making and implementation. So going kind of more onto the skills side of things, a little more tangible. So conducting research and acquiring knowledge, spatial analysis, public engagement. The 4 topics that I kind of have called out as part of the planning process, knowing what sort of that a formal planning process is, and being able to talk about it and think about it in different ways, in detailed ways. Project or program management and social justice are some other topics that you'll want to spend time on. For conducting research and acquiring knowledge, one of the key, one of the key things here that, again, I remember spending a lot of time studying is the quantitative analysis stuff. So you actually do have to kind of go back, and if you haven't done like statistical analysis for a long time, that some of those questions are in there. Spatial analysis that relates to GIS and mapping, and you're not going to be asked to map anything or do GIS in the exam, but you may be asked questions about those processes and what would you do in these scenarios and things like that. I'm just going to move my chat box in case I see anything come up in there. So again, I've just kind of starred what I'm kind of recommending priority on. Areas of practice. So this is 30% of the exam. And this is one of those things that I didn't put any priority stars on this slide because there isn't really anything specific. I never felt that really stood out over anything else. It's really about refreshing your knowledge on as many of these areas of practice that you can and have time to do. And I would also recommend thinking of it as kind of doing a broad and high level overview of as many of these topics as you can. So it's possible that you might get a very detailed question about something about a very specific area of practice, but I think thinking about it from an efficiency of your study time and what you can kind of expect to get on the exam, it's really just not feasible to do a deep dive on each of these topics because there are so many things. So just kind of refreshing, like, what are the key things for each of these areas of practice that someone should know, and running the risk that, yeah, you might get a really, really detailed question on something, but you can't really necessarily reasonably prepare for that. So that's what I kind of recommend. But basically, areas of practice is just like all the planning topics. And most people kind of focus in their career on one or two of these. So obviously, you probably don't have to study that topic very much. But for many of us, we might not have thought about economic development planning since maybe we had some readings on it in school or something like that. So if you are well into your career and you've been doing something in a very specific area of practice, don't focus on that. Focus on the other ones that you haven't really had much engagement with, like housing or parks or whatever the case is for your situation. There is a 5% portion of the exam related to leadership, administration, and management. So this one is, these are questions that I feel kind of relate to sort of the ethics piece of it, but it's really about best practices, just thinking about, specific to planning, but also generally what APA or AICP feels is important related to these different topics. It's a small portion of the exam, and in my experience, there isn't a whole lot to study. A lot of it is kind of common sense, to be honest. But nevertheless, definitely go through and look at some of that stuff on this topic. And then the last topic is the AICP Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct. So as part of your application, you should have or would have had to sign the Code of Ethics or agree to the Code of Ethics, but you'll definitely want to revisit that again, become familiar with the different topics, and specifically some of the scenarios of questions like, who should I contact if I think there's an ethics violation? Or what is the process if I'm found to be in violation of a code of ethics? And how do I appeal that? And do I lose my AICP and for how long? And some of those technical things are in there, but also kind of bigger picture scenario questions like, is this a violation of the code of ethics? And again, this is one of those where you're going to choose the best answer, and it sometimes is tricky. But just kind of going back to the code of ethics, and if there's something specifically called out in that related to the question. And these are longer questions. So a lot of these questions, you'll read multiple paragraphs because you'll have to kind of know a little bit of background in order to answer it. So that's just something to be aware of, that these questions might take a little more time just because there's different elements that you have to kind of understand about the scenarios. So creating a study plan. So it seems like a lot of you are planning to take this in May. And if you are, and you have created a study plan, maybe this can just kind of help you refine that. Or if you're just looking at starting studying now, or you're going to be taking it at another time, I would always recommend that people create a study plan. You're going to want to review your exam content outline, so kind of the topics that we just went through, and essentially map that out. So when are you going to study each of those topics, and then organize your resources that are going to help you study each of those topics. So you're going to want to balance your time by the categories in the exam that I just went through, but you're also going to want to balance your time based on your strengths and weaknesses that you might be already aware of. Something that might be easy for someone might, not necessarily be something someone else is already knowledgeable about. So someone might have to spend a lot of time, for example, on planning theory. And maybe some of you who are in grad school right now, maybe that stuff is really fresh for you. So maybe you don't have to spend as much time on that, and you have to go into, say, some of the areas of planning section or something like that. I would recommend starting 3 or 4 months in advance. 2 months if you have a lot of time that you can spend on a weekly basis. Obviously, how much in advance you start studying really just depends on how much time you're able to budget each week. And again, just map out that study plan. So again, my kind of experience with this was I did start studying 3 to 4 months ahead of time. I think I really dug in the last 2 months. I set aside 4 to like 6 or 4 to 8 hours a week. So I didn't do, it wasn't too crazy, but I, would set a lot of my time I would set aside on Sunday afternoon. Obviously you can do it whenever works for your schedule, but just kind of thinking about that and putting it on your calendar, I think is really helpful. I did develop kind of a sample study plan based on the one that I created. Honestly, it's not rocket science, but sometimes it's nice to see an example. So what I kind of did was I mapped out the 4 months leading up to my exam date in my case, and basically set aside which topics each week that I was going to try to focus on. And I'm going to share a link to this with you all, which is in a Google Doc, so you can look at it and actually copy it and edit it copy it into your own document and use it if you want to as a template or something just to get started. But I basically had my topic areas based on that breakdown of the percentages that I already went over, broke down the subcategories within those topic areas that I was going to try to focus on. And then basically each week I went through and found the resources for that topic area and really just tried to cover that stuff. And as this time period went on, there were weeks where I didn't study as much as I had planned to. So then I would kind of go back and move things around, obviously as life happens and things like that. But I'm going to open that up just to show you guys a little bit more detail in a minute. But just a few more tips are really just to to start early, try to stick to your study plan as much as you can. If you can, identify some form of outer accountability. So I do have a poll that I'm going to launch about if you're interested in actually being a part of a study group, and then I can basically send an email to those people to connect you. And I'll do that in a few minutes here. Focus on your areas of weakness. Again, as you start studying, you're going to, notice certain things that you are like, what? I don't remember any of this. And you're going to want to spend more time on it. Thinking about how to be most efficient with your time. So I will talk about that a little bit more on this related to the study resources in a minute. But just thinking about how you can be efficient with your time, because a couple of things that I heard when I was taking it that I thought was good advice was, passing is passing. You don't get more points for getting 100% of your questions right. I think just being realistic with your time, and, if there's certain topics that that you might not get as much time to spend on, I think to a degree that's okay. Of course, you don't want to do that for everything, because then you won't get that 55 that you need. But just thinking about that, and then just thinking about how to be the most efficient with your study time, thinking about how you study best. And I'll talk a little bit more about that about these resources. But so sort of the study guides that you'll see out there, and AIPA will say this too, is they'll recommend these books. And I think that these are good to have on hand. And it really just kind of depends on your personal, preference on how you study. But maybe focusing on the top few of these that you'll need extra time on. So for example, if you have never really done much in your career related to design, you might want to focus on the Planning and Urban Design Standards book and just review that and look through it. Local planning, depending on where your career has taken you, if you haven't done a lot of local planning or something like that, looking into those things. But I certainly, I know that again, the study guides will recommend this. I certainly, wouldn't necessarily say you should read these from cover to cover. I don't know that that's realistic. These are really big books, and they're also expensive. So if you can get access to one, if you don't have these already, if you can get access to one through your job or even through the library, and just take it out for a few weeks and just go through it, that's gonna help you. Other resources. So in the past few years, APA has really opened up actually a lot more resources themselves, which I think is good. They used to have some exam like programs that you would have to pay for, and they've actually kind of gone away with that, probably for different reasons. When I took it, I actually did purchase one of their study programs, and I used it, but I honestly got just as much benefit out of a lot of the free resources, if not more, out of the free resources. So after that, I always recommended people that I knew were taking it, don't waste your money on these paid programs. But now I think that's kind of, like I said, it's kind of gone away. People don't really offer those much anymore. I'm sure there's some out there, but it's not as much of a thing as I think it was in the past. But there are these selected readings that, again, APA has on their website. There are policy guides, there's stuff on the Code of Ethics, and then there's stuff on the National Planning Pioneers I would suggest looking at. Again, more on the planning website. The foundational land use law cases, this is a big one. This was a big part of my study plan, was looking at that quite a bit. The history of planning. Again, this is one of those things that you probably haven't thought much about since you were in school. And I think there's actually, this timeline is actually really cool. It's an interactive timeline you can click through. And again, it's on the planning website. And then I recommend kind of prioritizing these 4 things specifically, and then going over the practice exam questions. So APA provides some practice exam questions that I would highly recommend looking at. But then there's also another resource I'll show in the next slide, or the next 2 slides, that has some practice exams. But the reason I don't recommend as much spending time on these PAS reports in the planning magazine is not because they're not good resources, but it's hard to know how to prioritize your time looking at those resources because they are so broad. And frankly, I have no idea how you would even go about reviewing like the planning magazine to study from. There's just so many articles in there. How would you have any idea of what to focus on? I think this is one of those things where, like, if on your exam you get like this random question about some specific article or technical report, I mean, you can try to study for that, but it's just, again, it goes back to kind of the efficiency side of things. And I just remember thinking, like, there's, decades of planning magazines. How do you even go about starting? It's not realistic to like read all the planning magazines. So I put that on here because it is a recommended resource, but I don't necessarily recommend prioritizing your time on those things. Some free web resources. Again, the APA has a lot on their website now, including some recorded presentations from an exam prep that was held at the last planning conference, national planning conference. So highly recommend that resource. Planningprep.com. This was mentioned last week, but this is another good one that you can look at. I'm gonna just swap my screen that I'm sharing right now so you guys can see what that looks like, since we have a minute here. All right, hold on. Are you guys seeing planningprep.com? Okay, so this is a really comprehensive web resource that has, that's free to use. It has a lot of practice exams on here. And so that's something I would recommend. This is obviously out of date. Don't look here for the details about the exam, but there's a lot of different things on here. You have to create an account, and then once you log in, you'll be able to see that. And then one of the best resources that I found when I was taking it, and it is a little bit even more outdated now than when I took the exam. So just keep that in mind. But this planning webcast series has these detailed presentations on a whole bunch of different topics. And there's playlists on here. And you can just go through and look at the different videos. Obviously, there's a lot on here, so you'll definitely want to prioritize what you decide to look at. But one thing I did, and this may not be relevant now because of the pandemic, but in my case, I was at a job at the time where I had to do a decent amount of travel. So I would actually like play this, not watch the videos, but play the audio while I was driving. And that was kind of how I studied at the time. But just thinking about different things like that, like you don't necessarily always have to be sitting down with your computer and going through things. Like there's ways that you might be able to listen to some of this in the background while you're doing, while you're cooking dinner or something. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you can fit this into your week, but I do remember feeling like I got a lot of value out of some of these videos. And I thought I remembered that they had a playlist specific to the AICP. So maybe if I can find that, I'll share that as well. But there's a lot on here related to the AICP exam, topics that are covered in the AICP exam. I'm just going to go back here. Whoops. So let me just go back one slide here. But yeah, there's a lot of other web resources out there, but I think this also goes back to trying to be efficient with your time. It's not really that useful to try to go scour the internet for every single thing. If you find a few good resources that are relatively comprehensive, I mean, start there. There's plenty of resources out there to spend your time on. There's also things like there's flashcards that are pre-made out there that you can find. There's I've seen different study guides out there, but I think a lot of them are pretty outdated at this point, so I didn't add them to the list. But I think, you know, basically a handful of these resources are going to get you pretty much where you need to be for the exam. So I'm gonna just show you guys this study plan here quick, and then I will open it up for questions. Just bear with me for 1 sec. I gotta open it. Maybe. There we go. All right. Okay. So this is just, again, that study plan that whoops, there we go, that I had kind of put together for myself, and I just sort of modified it to be a little bit more general. But I do have that link in there. Feel free to use this and modify it for your own use. You can add, you know, your own. I have, like, you know, spend the last couple of weeks focusing on anything I didn't get to, or any like weak areas, doing some practice exams. You know, you fill this in with your resources and put your actual dates on here if you'd like to. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it for my kind of run through, and I want to open it up for any questions that people might have. I'm going to just stop sharing my screen here.
Liz, I have a question. So how similar, do you remember how similar you thought the illustrative questions were to the actual exam, and how similar the planning prep practice exams are to the actual exam?
Yeah, I think they were similar. I think the questions themselves were obviously different, but the format of the questions were similar and the content was similar. So I think those are good resources to use as examples. But I do remember specifically some of the illustrative questions, feeling like those were a little even extra wonky than some of the questions on the exam. So like what I mean by that is even trickier than some of the questions as far as like which is the best answer. So it always made me wonder, like, if those were true questions or if some of those were like pre-test questions or something like that.
Okay, thanks.
I'm sorry if I missed it. Where did you say we would find your study guide?
So I don't have maybe I misinterpreted what I was going to share, but I don't have a study guide per se. I have kind of that sample plan, and then I'll share the PDF of the resources. And I mean, if that's, I'm new to this role, so if that's something that anyone would find particularly useful, I could definitely look at developing one of those. It might not be very helpful to you if you're taking it in May. I don't think I would do it by then, but, or to make it useful for you to use it in May, but that would be good, I guess, good feedback.
Would you say that the questions and topics really stay true to traditional, tried and true theoretical practice, or do they put current topics in there? I mean, 2020 has changed so many different things. So I'm wondering if some of those are going to start coming into play that we don't even have a lot of publications on yet.
Yeah, I wouldn't really expect anything too current, because each question has to go through this process of basically getting tested and going through their kind of vetting process for a question before it even gets on the exam. So I think the most questions on the exam, the newest that you'll get, are probably like already 2 years old. So I wouldn't be too concerned with focusing on, super immediate things. And definitely I wouldn't expect anything from 2020 life to be on there, to be honest. I don't
Okay,
think it's
good.
gonna be that current.
Not that it's very important, but it's
Yes.
just like, where's my resources and all that. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And just to add to that answer too, like, and again, in my recollection, and I think I will have the opportunity to actually take the exam again as a test in a few years to just kind of refresh my own knowledge on it. But from my personal knowledge of taking it myself, I only remember a couple of really sort of current event type questions. A lot of it was more planning theory, law questions. What is the floor area ratio? What is the mode? What is the mean? Like all of these that aren't really relevant to a certain time or place. They're just very kind of objective questions for the most part. Objective might not be the right word, but it's like something that's really kind of tried and true type of planning topic. I think I also mentioned there was a couple of, as I was preparing for this, I added some notes that I think I kind of lost in my PowerPoint, but what I wanted to remind people about were some of the kind of more technical questions that I remember being a little surprised about on the exam. So I mentioned like floor area ratio and like how many, how big is an acre, and just some of those questions that again, I think would fall under the topic of plan making and implementation under the conducting research topic, but in acquiring knowledge. And there's basically quantitative and qualitative analysis questions and things like that. I think I was maybe, I don't know, I didn't remember studying those types of things as much. There's questions like if you're allowed to have, if your zoning code allows for this kind of a setback, how big can your your site, your building be, and things like that. So some of it's a little bit like you can't necessarily study for that exact question, but you can familiarize yourself with all the terms and make sure you remember, what all these things mean and things like that. So I'm going to launch this poll right now. The first question I actually, you can answer it if you want, but it was more about who's on, which we kind of covered in the introductions. But if you want to specifically respond to whether or not you are interested in joining a study group, I can connect people on via email so people can communicate. And if you do want to join a study group for May or for November specifically, I can connect you. And then I do plan to do some form of this run through probably once a year. So my term is 3 years. So I do plan on doing it for the next year or two. So if you're still in the realm of not sure when you're going to take it, you can always, I don't know, I guess depend on, at least for the next few years, I'll do something like this and you'll have a chance to connect with people. But I'm going to end this.
Liz, can I ask a question? So the way that one survey question was asked for the November, we don't need to sign up for that, right? It's just you sign up like in May for the
Yes.
November one?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So this is more like you're kind of intending to take it in November. But you, you would not have registered for that yet. You would not have been able to register for that yet. And I'm only assuming it's in November. I guess that's when they've traditionally held the fall exam, but that's not even on their website yet. So you still have plenty of time. You could have applied and pushed your exam date out, but you also probably haven't even applied yet. So I'm
Thank you.
gonna I just thought I'd share these for you guys, but I'll actually share the email addresses and things with you all. Any other questions?
I don't have a question, but I wanted to share some resources that I've been using. So the Pennsylvania chapter has a study guide. It is outdated. It's from 2007, but some of all that foundational information is the same. And I actually had that printed out because I was sick of staring at my computer screen. So it costs about $30 if anyone's interested in getting something like that printed out. Study Stack has a lot of those flashcards that you were saying, Liz. So if you just search for Study Stack, and then you can search for AICP, and a lot of people have already created flashcards. So you can do the flashcards, or like below, they like have all of the flashcards, like the word and the definition. So you can use that to study. And then also there's a podcast called the Unofficial AICP Podcast, I think. So if you search for that wherever you listen to podcasts, I know some of us on this call have been listening to that. It's got some good historical information, and then also really great just studying tips, pretty similar to what you already told us. And then also some really good information on the essays.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm gonna look at those and add, I may add them to my resources kit. I wasn't aware of the exam study guide from Pennsylvania, so that's a good one to know, or the podcast. I would have loved to have that podcast when I was like listening. I was basically just listening to YouTube videos like they were a podcast, but I mean, yeah, that would be a big one. A nice way to study.
The Colorado chapter also has a couple of practice tests, so
Awesome.
that's a good place for practice tests.
Anybody else have resources that they've been using, or even just other tips that you would want to share? Just kind of open that up because that's always good. Yeah, and I can share, I'll send out a follow-up email like I did last week, and I'll try to link those things, Kate, that you mentioned. If I can't find them, I'll send you a note, but I'm sure I'll probably be able to find them if I just was taking a few notes. So if I'll Google it and make sure I can find it, but that's helpful. Any other questions about the exam, or just any of the sort of logistical stuff about Prometric, or the the application? If you do have any more questions about the application, I can answer those right now, even though we kind of focused on that more last week, or the essays.
Where are the Prometric sites in Wisconsin?
Yeah, so there are, I think, 5 sites. There's Brookfield, Madison, Ashwaubenon, Wausau, and Eau Claire. So they do have kind of geographically them pretty well spread out. So most people in the state should have relatively easy access to them, depending on where you live.
That's great.
All right. Well, unless there's anything else, I will end our call and share the details. David, are you trying to say something, or are you talking to someone else? Maybe he's talking to someone else. Okay. All right.
Liz, was there anything that showed up like a lot on the exam that surprised you? Like a category, or like something where you like law or something like that, where you just felt like it was like a lot of the more than you maybe would have thought?
Yeah, I feel like I do remember a lot of law questions specifically. Again, it's obviously it's kind of a mixed bag on what you get, or it's a little bit randomized, but I do remember a lot of law questions, and thinking I should have studied those more. Even though I felt like I studied them a lot, I should have studied them even more. And then I think there were a decent amount of questions I remember about some of those like historical figures and some of the early legislation that enabled planning, and like the Clean Water Act and the different things like that I remember studying, but thinking like, oh, was that actually the right date, or did I confuse those, or things like that. Yeah. I remember for me personally, and I've heard people say the opposite, but I I felt like the toughest sections for me were the fundamental planning knowledge and the plan making and implementation, but specifically under that one, the research, so the qualitative and quantitative research stuff, so like statistical analysis and things like that, and then spatial analysis, just refreshing things that I maybe hadn't worked on for a while. And again, for me, I thought the leadership and administration stuff was like no-brainer type common sense. And then the AICP Code of Ethics, once I was familiar with the Code of Ethics, I don't necessarily remember those questions being super tricky, but I also remember talking to someone else who said they did, that was like their worst section was the ethics. So I, again, like take it with a grain of salt, but I remember for me that was, and the areas of practice, I remember spending a lot of time trying to cover those different areas of practice. And because there are so many topics, it's really hard to try to figure out what questions you're going to get, because you might get, you know, there's 170 questions total. So you might get, 10 or 15 questions on that. And it might be like, you just have no idea what you're going to get. So you can study it. And I just recommend like kind of doing a broad brush stroke over as many of those topics as you can. But I don't remember that specifically being as, super challenging, but again, it just kind of depends on what questions you get. And I also don't remember having a problem with the 3.5 hour time limit, and I'm a slow test taker. So I almost always, like in school and everything, would take the whole time or almost the whole time to take an exam, and I had time. So again, depends on your personal situation, but I wouldn't get too stressed out about the time limit. I remember having time to go back and look at things, and I don't think I spent quite the whole 3.5 hours. I was close, but I wasn't under, didn't like run out of time by any means. So I had plenty of time to go back and look at things.
On the going back, is the flagging on Prometric complicated at all, or is it pretty straightforward? I mean,
yeah, no, that's a good question. I remember that being pretty straightforward. Yeah, I don't remember that being problematic at all. And I mean, they're helpful. They're friendly. I actually had a weird thing happen where like my computer shut off when I was taking it. And that was like terrifying, but like it was fine. And they were friendly. And I remember taking advantage of the noise canceling headphones because it's super quiet in there and you can hear just people clicking on their mouses. And obviously just making sure you take all the required materials with you, like your ID and, take your, they offer, I think, scratch paper and different things like that. So I remember taking advantage of that, but that all I think went smoothly from my perspective. So, and I took it in Brookfield.
Thank you. That is very helpful. Thanks.
Those are very helpful. I'm wondering, do you know, is there a pass-fail rate?
That's a good question. I don't know what it is, but I'm sure we could find it. Yeah, I'm not sure, but
okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm just kind of like Googling it really quick. They have it broken down by, oh, okay. So it says the mean pass rate is 76%. But they actually have it broken down by like what planning program you attended. So that's interesting.
Hey Liz, I have a kind of different kind of question, I guess, but about the registration stuff for it, and could be a little different because I'm doing the pilot program thing. But I like registered for the May exam and like paid and stuff, I think back in like the very end of January. And I recently checked my like kind of AICP status thing, whatever, on the APA website, and I still don't see like confirmation that I've registered for it or anything. How would I make sure that I'm good to go with it?
Yeah, let me check on that, and I'll find like a person that you can contact because I'm not sure about that, but I'll find like a person you can reach out to or a phone number that you can call.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
For the law cases, how much detail do you think we should know for them?
Yeah, I'm trying to just think about that for a second. I remember the law questions varied a lot about what exactly they were even asking. So sometimes it would ask something like, what year was this law case, or in which order did these law cases occur? And sometimes it would actually ask questions about the content of the law case, and like if there was a precedent that was set, it would ask specific questions related to that. So yeah, that's one of those where, again, I think I remember thinking, gosh, I should have studied those even more, because there were, yeah, it could come at you from different angles. But also my background, basically, since I've been in planning professionally, has been in transportation. So I haven't really touched a lot of the land use stuff as much as some people might be if they're working in local planning law, and maybe you're like, well, of course that, that case or something. I don't know, maybe not, but
I'm also in transportation planning and have only worked at that. So
yeah,
reviewing all this stuff, I'm like, I don't even remember what zoning is.
yeah, exactly. You're like, wait, what? How did that work? Yeah. All right. All right. Well, thank you all for attending. I will be, like I said, following up with an email and add some of those additional resources that you shared, Kate, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions, or if you're still in the process of deciding or need more assistance with like the application essay stuff. You can let me know about that as well. All right. And I'll send the email about the study group too. So that'll be separate. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
You.
Have a good one.
Thank you.
You.
Very much.